Sirens bounced off the metal walls of Riverpoint Casting Works as Amos Ritchie rolled his old truck to a stop. Smoke pushed out through broken windows and curled over Gray Ridge, Ohio, like a dark tide. Fire crews shouted, hoses snapped across gravel, and men from town ran toward the gate, calling out names. Amos stepped down, knees aching, and stared at the orange glow rising from Line C, the one his son Nathan worked. Flames roared where his careful pipes and vents once kept heat moving smooth and steady. People in Gray Ridge would later whisper that Amos caused this, that the quiet foreman finally snapped. Truth sat hidden in his notebooks, in the drawings no one from corporate had bothered to read. Tonight, though, all he could see was a roof folding in and a shift that would never clock out. Before we go back and untangle how this started, where are you watching from? Stay with this story because the records from that night still divide this town deeply. The records from that night still divide Gray Ridge. And to see why, you have to step back from the fire and stand on the river levee above town. Today, the Ohio rolls slow and brown past empty docks, and the shell of Riverpoint Casting Works sits dull and quiet on the far bank. If you close your eyes up there, you can almost hear what this ridge sounded like in 1968. Metal hammers, shift whistles, and 1,000 men pouring out at dawn. Once, Gray Ridge was the kind of place where a boy's future fit inside those brick walls. Loading barges, running molds, turning wrenches on the big ladles. That was the plan for most sons. The town had 3 bars, 2 diners, 4 churches, and a little league diamond that sat in the furnace glow on summer nights. Families came up from eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee when the mines shut down. Folks like Amos Ritchie carried mountain names and hard habits across the river and set them down here. Old newspapers back this up better than memory. If you pull Gray Ridge Gazette clippings from the late 60s and early 70s, the front page runs on pride. Riverpoint adds 3rd shift, record output on Line C, new homes going up on Maple Street. Census tables from those years show the town swelling, schoolrooms packed, and church parking lots full of Fords bought on factory pay. For a while, the place felt safe. If you could handle heat and noise, you could feed a family. The curve turned fast. By the late 70s, those same papers start to sound thin and worried. One month, it's foreign steel cuts orders, then barge traffic down, then Riverpoint freezes hiring. You see small ads for auctions as shops along Main Street close. Inside the plant, pressure rolled downhill. Supervisors were told to do more with less. Maintenance budgets shrank. Orders still had to ship on time, so someone had to stretch parts, skip steps, look the other way. A foreman would bark, "Just keep that line moving," when a man pointed out a leaking valve. On paper, inspections stayed perfect. In the real world, welders taped cardboard over broken windows to keep the winter wind out and hoped nothing sparked. Gray Ridge had its own rules long before any corporate handbook. Men from the hills brought a quiet code with them. You look after your own, you don't run to outside authorities, and you solve problems as close to home as you can. The plant, the union hall, and the bars worked like one small country, with grudges and favors tracked in memory. Side hustles filled the gaps that wages left. Some workers hauled scrap at night. A few ran poker games in basement rec rooms. 1 or 2, including a younger Amos, still knew how to rig a small still in a shed and trade jars for cash or parts. Those same hands that cooled mash in hidden hollows learned to read metal, steam, and pressure inside Riverpoint. They knew that pipes could sing right before they burst. Amos fit that world in a quiet way. He didn't drink much at the bars. He wasn't the loudest voice at union meetings. Instead, he watched, listened, and wrote things down. In his lunch pail, beside his sandwich, he kept a small notebook where he logged hours, leaks, and strange noises the big company forms never mentioned. No one paid much attention to that habit in those years. Later, those small, careful pages would mean more than anyone in Grey Ridge could guess. Back home, those pages didn't live in a neat office. They sat in the cool half-dark of Amos Ritchie's basement, under the small house he'd bought when Riverpoint went to 3 shifts. The floor was bare concrete, stained with oil. One bulb on a cord threw a yellow circle over a rough workbench built from 2 sawhorses and an old plank door. Jars lined the wall, some full of nails, others holding cloudy liquid that smelled faintly like corn and smoke. Along that back wall lay the real center of Amos's world. Coiled copper tubing from his Kentucky days, dented stockpots, a rusted thumper keg, and rolled plant blueprints sat in a crowded line. Inside an army ammo box, he kept slim notebooks sorted by year. Each one held tight pencil script, numbers, and small drawings of vents and valves. To anyone else, it might have looked like junk from a man who never threw anything away. To Amos, it was his life's trail, laid down in lead and paper. Childhood in the hills taught him that some things stayed off the books. His father's stills ran in hollows where lawmen rarely walked. The older man showed him how cold creek water and copper coils could turn hot vapor into clear liquor. He also gave one rule over and over. You protect a good run like you protect your kin. You don't sell the recipe, you don't brag on it, and you never hand it to someone who hasn't bled for it. Years later, standing under Riverpoint's tired vents, that rule sat in Amos's head. The plant system rattled and coughed, wasting heat, leaving pockets of gas where men worked. He saw at once how the old still tricks could ease that danger. If coils could cool mash, they could guide heat and fumes out of those low rooms. After shift, he bent scrap pipe over sawhorses in the basement, watching steam curl the way he wanted. What he built wasn't a patent on a wall. It was a working fix, born from the hills, shaped to keep a crew alive. Family life wrapped around that secret work. His wife, Ruth, stayed upstairs, listening to metal clink and pencil scratch while she cooked. She'd leave a cup of coffee on the top step, then go back to the stove. Their children were told the basement was Daddy's work, not a play space. Nathan, the oldest, still crept down sometimes to sit on the bottom step, chin on his knees, eyes on the pipes. Amos rarely spoke soft praise, yet he passed a wrench into that boy's hand and showed him how to tighten a clamp just right. In Amos's mind, this was the only real inheritance he had to give. The land back in Kentucky was long sold, the coal jobs gone, and factory pay rose and fell with orders. What remained was a way to read heat, metal, and air so you didn't die quick because someone higher up cut corners. Scars on his arms from Vietnam and from early years on greasy floors reminded him what happened when systems failed. Pain had taught him to trust what he could measure, not what the front office promised. So he measured. While other men swapped jokes during breaks, Amos slipped into side halls and jotted small notes. A fan running hot, a vent slow to clear, an alarm that chirped once and went silent. Each night at the basement bench, he copied those scraps into his main notebook, drew layouts, and marked dates beside whoever had brushed off his concern. He wasn't planning a lawsuit then. He was fighting a deeper fear of being helpless, of seeing trouble grow and having no proof it was there. From a distance now, it's easy to see those notebooks as more than a habit. They were a kind of shield he tried to build out of paper and pencil in a world that didn't care much about his quiet skill. No one in Grey Ridge thought about that shield before the fire. Nobody upstairs asked what lived in the ammo box under his workbench. When the night came that Nathan didn't walk back through the front door, those same worn pages would become the one thing Amos had left to stand on. By the mid-80s, Riverpoint's upstairs offices had gone still in a way that made men nervous. The big wallboard that once bragged about new orders now showed red lines through contracts and notes about efficiency targets. Coffee pots burned dry on hot plates. When managers called meetings in the second-floor conference room, crews knew someone, somewhere, was about to lose hours or tools. Leon Pike floated through that tension like he was born for it. On the floor, he laughed loud, slapped backs, and made long nights feel shorter. In the break room, he remembered who had a kid in the hospital and who'd buried a father last year. In union meetings, he stood near the front, nodding with the men, while keeping an eye on the plant superintendent at the back. Folks said Leon could talk a storm into passing. One gray afternoon, he carried a fat manila folder into that conference room. Outside, forklifts beeped and metal clanged. Inside, carpet muffled sound, and the blinds were half shut. 3 Riverpoint executives sat with cost sheets spread out. Leon laid his folder on the table and started a small, smooth speech about airflow optimization and reduced downtime. He flipped to neat diagrams of new vent routes, trimmed purge cycles, and coil bends that would save labor hours per week without major capital expense. Those paths were not his. They'd started years earlier in Amos Ritchie's basement, drawn in pencil beside coiled copper and a sweating mason jar. Amos had stood down there once or twice, shaking his head like it was all too clever for him. Now the same shapes appeared in ink on clean paper, with a typed title at the top: Pike Vent Efficiency Proposal. The men in shirts and ties didn't ask who had first sketched those lines. They saw numbers at the bottom of each page that promised savings. By the time the wall clock ticked around to the next hour, they'd signed off on his plan. A memo went out saying the new setup would modernize legacy systems on lines B and C. Downstairs, Amos noticed changes in pieces. A supervisor told him, "Skip the long purge, we're behind." Dampers he'd long insisted stay open longer were now tagged to close early. When he asked a young engineer why, the answer came quick: Pike's new vent plan, it's approved upstairs. That night, in his basement, Amos spread plant printouts beside one of his old notebooks. Even in the dim light, he saw it clear. Pipe runs matched, turns matched, even a strange little dogleg he'd added to duck under a support beam on line C. On his page, the corner held his initials in crooked letters. On the clean copy, that space held a company logo and Leon's name. To Amos, a man could borrow a tool or even ask for a loan, but he didn't take another man's craft and slap his own mark on it. Especially not a craft that had grown out of family lessons and war scars. That kind of theft cut deeper than money. It reached back to fathers and forward to sons. From that week on, Amos changed a habit. Whenever a work order, vent sketch, or schedule touched his hands, he made a copy or wrote the key parts into his own notebook. He didn't yet know who might ever read them. All he knew was that a line had been crossed on paper, and someday he might have to prove it to people who trusted ink more than they trusted any man from Grey Ridge. Weeks slid by after Amos first saw Leon's name stamped on his work. The Pike Plan rolled out in slow, steady steps. Purge times on the schedule sheets shrank by a minute here, 2 minutes there. On the floor, men felt the change in their lungs and in the way the heat hung low over the line. Small scares started. A pocket of gas made a crew cough and back away. An alarm chirped, then fell quiet before anyone could reach it. Each time, a shift report called it minor or handled on site. Amos noticed that the words were always the same. He also noticed whose name sat at the bottom of those pages: Leon Pike, line supervisor. In his basement, Amos laid those reports beside his own notes. Dates lined up. The first sharp flare had come the week after purge cycles were cut. The The bad alarm sat under a vent Leon ordered half-closed to save heat loss. It didn't take a degree to see the pattern. Still, Gray Ridge had its way of doing things. When a place fed your family, you tried not to drag its name through outside mud unless you had to. The Union Hall was where trouble went first. One cold evening, Amos walked up the cracked steps into the old brick building that had watched over contracts for 30 years. Inside, rows of metal chairs faced a low stage. Men filled the room, shoulders hunched in winter coats, faces drawn from long shifts. A chalkboard on stage held the night's agenda. Near the top, someone had written, "Safety Concerns, Line C." Amos sat halfway back, his notebook closed on his knee. He listened while two younger workers stood and talked about near misses, about feeling heat wrap around them in new ways. Leon rose when they finished. He stood at the front, hands open, voice smooth. He spoke about temporary adjustments, about management pressure, about doing the best we can with what we've got. He promised that he would meet with the plant superintendent. He said there was no need to panic or make it sound worse than it is on any official form. When the room broke for coffee, Amos moved to the side with a small knot of older men. The local union president, Gray at the Temples, told him they'd file a grievance, note the scares, and ask for a review. That fit the code Amos had lived by for years. You handled trouble close to home. You trusted the hall and the men you'd stood beside for decades. So when he went back to work, he wrote his next complaint on the standard form and slid it into the metal box outside the union office. He did not yet reach past town lines. It was a choice made in good faith. It was also a mistake. Copies of the meeting notes show only general concerns and ongoing dialogue. No mention of Amos's older warnings, no mention of Leon's vent plan by name. Somewhere between the chalkboard and the typed minutes, edges were sanded off. Down in his basement that night, Amos opened his ammo box and wrote the date of the meeting, the names of the men who'd spoken, and a short line about the promise Leon made from that stage. He believed for the moment that those two records together would be enough if anything worse ever happened. He still thought the worst might not come. Upstairs, nobody seemed in a hurry to change anything. The plant ran on like always, humming toward. The plant kept humming after that union meeting, but the sound felt wrong to people who knew it well. The furnaces still roared, cranes still squealed, and Line C still shook the floor. Yet there was a new tightness in the air, a feeling that too much heat stayed trapped where it should have flowed away. Up in the small maintenance office, Darlene Stokes watched the change in a different way. Her world was paper and numbers. She sat at a metal desk under buzzing lights with a typewriter, a time clock, and stacks of forms. Every shift, foreman dropped incident reports and hours sheets in her inbox. Her job was to log them, copy them, and file them in gray cabinets that lined the wall. Before the Pike Plan, most reports had rough handwriting, crossed-out words, and little notes in the margins. Men wrote the truth they knew. Flare scared hell out of us, alarm stuck 3 times, smelled gas by valve 6. Darlene typed summaries, but kept the originals on file, just like the rulebook said. After the meeting, things came in cleaner. Reports arrived already typed, with neat phrases like minor issue and no injury. The words lined up too perfect, the ink too fresh. When she checked the carbon copies still hanging on clipboards by the line, they did not match. A report that once said, vent slow to clear, crew evacuated, now read, brief routine purge. One evening, Leon leaned in her office with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He set down a short stack of papers and asked her to straighten up the wording on some older forms. He said management wanted consistent language so outside inspectors would not misread harmless events. Darlene felt her stomach knot. For a moment, she thought of Amos, of the way he always paused at her window to ask for extra blanks and carried his own worn notebook. When the room emptied that night, she made a quiet choice. Instead of shredding the old versions, she slid them into a grocery bag under her desk. Each time a report came back fixed, she tucked the first one away. Time cards that showed men sent home early after scares joined them. She told herself it was only for a while, only until things settled. Weeks later, with the winter wind rattling loose panes, Amos stood in front of her desk and asked why his complaint about the vent cuts didn't show up in the official log. Darlene felt her throat go dry. She said the minutes were shortened at the hall, that maybe the union secretary had left details out. She did not mention the bag. That night, she carried it home anyway. Her rental house sat 4 blocks from the plant, close enough that the night shift rumbles shook her dishes. The kitchen was small, with faded linoleum, and a table pushed under the window. After her kids fell asleep, she pulled the bag from a closet and spread the papers in a rough stack. Different days, different pens, same pattern. Strong words on the first page, soft ones on the second. When Amos knocked on her door 2 evenings later, she almost didn't open it. Fear sat heavy on her chest. If the company found out she'd kept anything, she could lose the one steady paycheck between her and the dark. Yet Amos stood there with his hat in his hands, shoulders stooped in a way she had never seen. At that table, under a weak light, she finally showed him the stack. He read in silence, jaw tight, finger tracing the lines that had been trimmed away. Then he laid one of his notebooks beside the reports. Dates matched, his private notes about alarms and hotspots lined up with the erased phrases. In that cramped room, Amos saw that the hall, the office, and the plant were already working together to sand the truth down. The code he'd trusted for years had turned inward, more loyal to the company's name than to the men breathing that air. What he held in his hands was different. It was a double record, 2 versions of the same days. From that night on, his thinking shifted. He stopped believing a quiet word in the right ear could fix what was wrong. Instead, he started to see paper as his only real tool. His notebooks, Darlene's hidden copies, and any record he could pull before it vanished would be the thing he leaned on. He did not yet know how or who would listen, but he understood this much. If the people upstairs were going to rewrite what happened inside Riverpoint, someone down below had to keep the first draft safe. 2 weeks after Darlene spread those pages on her kitchen table, the people of Gray Ridge lined up at Harland & Sons' funeral home. 18 coffins didn't fit in one room, so the director scheduled viewings in a slow, grim chain. Amos came on Nathan's night, wearing the same dark suit he'd worn to his mother's burial back in Kentucky. The parking lot was full before sundown. Trucks lined the street, their bumpers nearly touching. From outside, the building looked too small to hold so much sorrow. Inside, the air carried flowers, floor polish, and the faint iron smell that clings to men who work around hot metal. Nathan lay in a polished box near the front, suit pressed smooth, wedding ring shining on his left hand. Amos stood at the edge of the line, palms damp, mind drifting back to the basement where copper and pencil marks had once seemed like a promise that his boy would be safer than he'd been. Now that promise lay still and cold under glass. Around the room, widows and parents clutched tissues and paperback hymnals. A few kids sat on folding chairs along the wall, swinging their legs, not yet old enough to grasp why so many adults whispered instead of laughed. Near the guest book, a man in a neat gray suit worked the crowd. He didn't look like anyone from the floor. A Riverpoint pin on his lapel and a thin briefcase by his ankle told Amos all he needed. After the first prayers, that lawyer began taking small groups into a side office. Darlene Stokes saw it happen while she poured coffee in the hallway. Widows went in with red eyes and shaking hands. They stepped out holding heavy white envelopes and blank stares. No one said much. The shift was plain. Grief met money, and money won. When Amos's turn came to stand near Nathan's widow, he noticed an envelope peeking from her purse. Her fingers kept brushing it, like she wasn't sure whether to hide it or hold on tight. He understood why she'd sign whatever they put in front of her. Bills piled up fast, and the plant's checks used to be the only steady thing in their mailbox. The sight of that envelope felt like dirt on a half-dug grave. Beside the register, a thin table held stacks of printed service programs. On the back page, just above a hymn verse, sat a line in small type, "Arrangements assisted by Riverpoint Casting Works Memorial Fund." Darlene picked one up and turned it over, thumb tracing the words. She glanced toward the office door where the lawyer waited and felt her courage leak away. If she stood with Amos now, if anyone learned about the bag of old reports under her closet floor down there, that quiet printed line might vanish from the next funeral program. Her kids needed shoes more than they needed a fight with men who signed checks. Later, in the hallway by the restrooms, Amos asked softly, "Will you stand by those copies if someone asks?" Darlene stared at the tiled floor. "I don't know," she said. Fear, duty, and shame twisted together inside her. He didn't push. He only nodded once and walked back toward Nathan's casket, feeling the room tilt a little. In that moment, Amos understood that witnesses could be bought or scared quiet, that memories faded, and that the people who'd lived this loss were being gently wrapped in money and kind words until the sharp edges dulled. Paper, he thought, was the only thing that stayed hard. The pile on Amos Ritchie's basement bench had grown into something that no longer looked like one man's habit. It was a small archive now. His hand-drawn vent layouts, Darlene's first version reports, Nathan's widow's unanswered letters, and copies of work orders that showed purge times shrinking even as complaints rose. He stared at it one evening, listening to the furnace kick on upstairs, and understood that he'd reached the edge of what he could do alone. Rivertown codes ran deep, but they stopped at courthouse doors. If he wanted the record to outlive whispers, he needed someone who spoke the language of filings and subpoenas. Gray Ridge didn't have many lawyers. Most handled wills, small divorces, and the odd property dispute. One name kept coming up when workers griped about back pay and bad shifts. A labor attorney who rented a second-floor office above a shuttered clothing store on Main Street. On a cold March morning, Amos climbed the steep stairs to that office. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and old carpet cleaner. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. A hand-painted sign on the door read, "Law Office of Ellen Marsh." Inside, the space felt more like a storage room than a place where big decisions got made. File boxes lined the walls. A coat tree leaned heavy with jackets. A single desk faced the window, buried in papers. Ellen looked up from a stack of forms when Amos stepped in. She was in her 40s, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled to the elbow. She'd seen his kind before. Calloused hands, quiet eyes, shoulders carrying more than one man's share of weight. She waved him to a chair and listened while he laid out the broad strokes. He didn't use big words. He talked about vents cut short, alarms that chirped once and died, reports changed on their way upstairs, and the night line sea flashed over and did not stop. When he slid his notebooks and copies across the desk, Ellen's posture changed. She went from polite attention to sharp focus. This wasn't just a story of grief. It was dates, numbers, and matching patterns. She turned pages, marking lines with a yellow pencil. Amos watched her stack items in small piles, warnings, altered logs, unanswered letters, cost-cutting memos. She explained what would matter beyond Gray Ridge. Regulatory offices and prosecutors needed more than anger. They needed a timeline that showed who knew what, when they knew it, and what they chose to ignore. They needed witnesses willing to swear that the first versions of those reports were true. They needed to see that changes weren't mistakes, but a habit. For Amos, who had long trusted only the quiet code of the plant and the hills, this sounded like a foreign road. Still, it matched something in him. The same part that had kept careful notes under dim basement light now found a kindred order in Ellen's legal pad. She drew a line down the center of a page, one side for before fire, one for after. Under each heading, she wrote the names of people and documents she'd have to nail down. Over the next few weeks, the small office above Main Street became a second home for his paper trail. Darlene was brought in after hours, sat in the hard chair opposite Ellen, and asked to walk through every report she'd seen changed. Her fear sat on her shoulders like a coat, but each time she matched a date or a phrase between Amos's copies and her own memories, the case grew thicker. Mathan's widow came in once, clutching a folder of bills and letters. Ellen asked gentle, steady questions, placing each letter on the chronological line. Other workers stopped by at dusk, caps in hand, to talk about alarms that stuck and meetings where concerns were brushed aside. Some refused to sign anything, afraid of losing the last good job in driving distance. Others agreed to at least let their words be written down, names held back until Ellen said it was safe. Slowly, a different picture of Riverpoint formed on those office walls. It was no longer just a place where a freak accident had burned 18 men. It was a system that had seen heat build, heard warnings, and chosen cheaper options anyway. Timing became the sharp edge. Ellen explained that the state would not act on rumor. A thick file had to land in the right hands, with enough weight that throwing it away itself would be a risk. She also knew that public pressure could tip scales. An anonymous packet on a quiet Tuesday might vanish in a mailroom. A formal complaint, backed by sworn statements and technical notes, arriving the same week as a somber local memorial, would be harder to ignore. So they circled a date on her wall calendar, the 1-year mark of the fire. The town would gather, candles would be lit, and news cameras might finally swing back to Grey Ridge. On that morning, Ellen would send complete evidence packets to the state attorney general and the regional OSHA office by courier, with receipts and signatures. A trusted reporter from a nearby city, briefed but held back until the filings were in, would receive copies soon after. As spring turned to summer, Amos kept bringing small additions, an old memo here, a copied schedule there, a note from an engineer who'd moved away but still remembered being told not to overcomplicate the vent review. Ellen checked each piece, added it where it fit, and locked duplicates in a cabinet. By early October 1989, the file was thick enough that it took 2 hands to lift. The night before the memorial, Ellen placed the final affidavit on top and closed the folder. Grey Ridge slept uneasily, still living in the shadow of Riverpoint's burned roof. In a cramped second-floor office and a worn-out man's basement, the story of that last shift waited in paper form, ready to walk into rooms where sirens could not reach. Morning came cold and flat over Grey Ridge on the 1-year mark of the fire. While families pulled on dark clothes for the memorial service, a courier van rolled down Main Street and stopped in front of the post office. Inside lay 2 heavy packets from Ellen Marsh's office, bound in twine and marked for overnight hand delivery, one to the state attorney general, one to the regional OSHA office. Each held copies of Amos's notebooks, Darlene's reports, Nathan's widow's letters, and sworn statements from men who'd worked the line. Paper that once lived under a basement light and on a kitchen table now rode north in a padded bag. At the Attorney General's building, a clerk signed for the envelope, slid it open, and saw the first page. Formal complaint, Riverpoint Casting Works fatal incident. By noon, a deputy AG with a stack of other files set the Riverpoint packet on top. As he thumbed through the contents, dates and phrases began to repeat. Vent cuts, short purges, alarms that failed, line C. The deputy circled a paragraph that mentioned burn patterns and gas levels. He picked up the phone and called the county coroner who'd handled the original autopsies. Down in the Gray Ridge coroner's office, Dr. Milton Avery still carried the pictures of that night in his mind. 18 bodies had come through his doors in less than 24 hours. Most were burned, some beyond easy recognition. At the time, with pressure to move fast and a plant lawyer hovering, he'd written thermal injuries due to industrial accident again and again. Cause, in simple terms, the fire. Now, a year later, he stood in the same chilled exam room with folders spread across a stainless steel table. The AG's request lay on top, asking him to review toxicology results and injury patterns in light of new information about vent systems and purge times. Beside it sat copies of Amos's vent drawings and OSHA's early notes. He opened Nathan Ritchie's file first. Photos showed blistered skin, soot along the nose and mouth, and a line on the throat where a respirator strap had held until it melted. The original tox report, done in haste, listed high levels of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. Back then, Avery saw those numbers as just another marker of a bad fire. Today, with diagrams showing how fumes had backed up over line C, they told a sharper story. Men trapped in a pocket of poisoned air that should have been cleared. File by file, the same pattern emerged. Workers from different parts of the line showed near identical gas levels, burns on the same side of the body, and signs of collapse in place rather than running escape. It was as if a wave had rolled through them all at once, a flashover fueled by a mix that never should have built up. Avery walked from the exam room to his small office, carrying the stack. He pulled the original plant incident report from his cabinet and set it beside Amos's hand-drawn layouts. Company forms said the fire had originated from unknown equipment malfunction and spread rapidly due to flammable materials in use. Amos's notes, made weeks and months before the blaze, pointed to tight vents and pooling gas in the very spot the flashover now appeared to have begun. Standing at his window, looking out over the parking lot where families had gathered a year before to claim their dead, Avery felt a slow anger rise. It wasn't the sharp fury of that first awful week. It was a colder thing, tied to the realization that the danger had been seen on the ground and softened on paper long before the bodies reached his slabs. He called the deputy AG back. This time, his voice carried more than just clinical detail. He spoke of consistent toxicology, of injuries that matched a specific type of burn event, and of prior complaints that aligned with his findings. He didn't say the word cover-up. He didn't have to. The silence on the other end of the line said enough. Word of renewed interest seeped out in small bits. A clerk mentioned extra files pulled from storage. A nurse in the clinic said she'd seen the coroner meet with state men. In a town where news moved along diner counters and church steps, folks began to sense that the story might not end with tragic accident after all. For Amos, the first sign came in a thin letter from the AG's office, delivered to Ellen's upstairs suite. It thanked him for his detailed documentation and requested his presence for a formal interview as a critical witness. The language was stiff, but one line stood out. Your records and the county coroner's findings suggest a pattern of negligence and falsified reporting at Riverpoint Casting Works. What had started as private grief and quiet notes had begun to turn into something larger. Bodies that once told only of fire, now, through charts and numbers, echoed the same warnings Amos had written under a single basement bulb. The pattern was no longer just in his head or on his shelves. It lived in official files, on state letterhead, and in the dawning understanding of a town that trusted a plant to look after its own. The letter from the Attorney General's office marked Amos Ritchie as a critical witness. At the same time, copies of his notebooks and Ellen Marsh's compiled file moved across another desk, in a low building of brick and glass an hour away, the regional OSHA field office. From the outside, the place looked plain. Inside, it held maps, binders, and people whose work was to turn accidents into numbers and rules. On a long conference table, staff spread out site photos of Riverpoint Casting Works taken in the days after the fire. Charred beams, warped rails, and blackened vents filled glossy frames. Beside them sat printed pages from Amos's records, Darlene's first version reports, and the company's neat incident summaries. An inspector drew a red line across a floor plan of Line C, tracing the route of the old vent system as it should have been. Then he overlaid a clear sheet marked with the Pike Vent efficiency changes. The two paths did not match. Where Amos's original design had pulled fumes up and out, the newer version kinked and tightened, saving heat but leaving pockets where gas could collect. On the wall, they pinned burn pattern diagrams from the county coroner. The worst damage tracked along the same route as the altered vents. Men had fallen where the air should have been safest. Step by step, the investigators began to build a picture that reached beyond a single bad night. They circled dates on a calendar taped to the wall. First complaints from Amos. First minor incident report from the line. First memo about cutting purge times. First time Darlene saw a report rewritten. Then they marked the last day of normal operation, the first recorded alarm failure, and finally the night of the flashover. Names sat under each mark. Leon Pike's signature appeared on cost-cutting orders and on corrected safety logs. Riverpoint executives' names showed up on approval lines for the vent changes and on checks to vendors that supplied cheaper parts. An engineer's initials appeared on a design review stamped "No significant hazard," despite notes about heat spots that matched Amos's warnings. Amos's own name, in contrast, appeared mainly at the bottom of maintenance requests and handwritten complaints, then again on the sworn statement Ellen had helped him write. The pattern was clear. One man raising flags, another smoothing them flat, and a layer of owners who signed where it suited them and looked away when it did not. The motive, in the dry language of reports, came down to money. Internal emails pulled from Riverpoint's files after the AG's request spoke of margin pressure and competitiveness. One note from a senior manager to Leon praised the vent plan for significant energy savings and reduced downtime exposure, with a line about risk profile acceptable. The risk, in human terms, would later be measured in coffins. At the OSHA office, staff filled out violation checklists. Each item had a box: adequate ventilation, proper alarm function, accurate reporting, training for hazardous conditions. Beside Riverpoint's entry, more than one box earned an X and a comment. In several places, Amos's notes and Darlene's saved originals stood as the only proof that things hadn't always looked clean on paper. Investigators returned to the Riverpoint site as well. The plant was still and cold now, a shell stripped of most valuable metal. Yet the bones remained. Lengths of pipe, rusting dampers, control panels with labels half burned away. Standing on the cracked floor of Line C, an inspector held Amos's drawing in one hand and a company blueprint in the other. The angles and junctions matched his pencil more than the official plan downstairs had ever shown.
They photographed every mismatch, every sign of a removed safety valve or a vent reduced in size. They took close shots of alarm mounts where newer, cheaper units had been installed shortly before the fire. Those images joined the others back at the office, forming another layer in the growing stack. Slowly, the question shifted from what happened to who allowed it. The AG's team, reading OSHA's findings, began to group people into circles. In the outer ring sat workers who followed orders, unaware of the bigger picture. In the next stood supervisors like Leon, who had both heard complaints and pushed cost cuts. In the inner ring stood executives who received upbeat memos about savings and signed off without asking why alarms now chirped and died. Motive, method, and opportunity, the three words prosecutors liked, all found homes in those circles. The company had a reason to cut corners. Leon had the knowledge to turn Avis's design into something leaner and riskier. Managers had the chance to stop the changes and chose not to. For Amos, this stage of the work happened at a distance. He did not sit in the OSHA office or walk the blackened line with a clipboard, yet his influence ran through it all. Every time an inspector matched a complaint date to a report, every time a photo lined up with one of his basement sketches, his quiet years of note-taking were folded into an official story. What had once been dismissed as the grumbling of a cautious maintenance man now framed an entire case. The network of choice and neglect that led to the fire was no longer hidden in side conversations and shuffled forms. It was pinned to walls, stamped with agency seals, and prepared for a different kind of room. A courtroom, where motives would be weighed in front of strangers and where the old Gray Ridge Code would have to share space with the law.
By the time the state and OSHA teams had their charts pinned to the walls, word slipped into Gray Ridge the old way, over eggs and weak coffee at Miller's Diner. The place sat on a corner near the tracks, windows fogged from steam, booths patched with tape. Men who once worked nights at Riverpoint now came in at 9, watched the door, and tried to guess what would happen next. A small TV hung in one corner above the pie case. Most days, it showed weather and ball scores. On this morning, it played a news brief from the state capitol. A sober anchor talked about new evidence in the Riverpoint fire and possible criminal charges against plant officials. When Amos Ritchie's name flashed for a moment as a key witness, a hush rolled across the room. At the counter, 3 older regulars stirred their coffee without drinking. One shook his head hard. To him, outside lawyers and state people meant trouble, not help. He muttered that you didn't drag your own town through court, no matter what. Another man, eyes on the screen, said quiet that 18 coffins were already more than enough reason. In a back booth, 2 younger women in clant jackets sat with their kids. One had a husband still working odd jobs 2 counties over. She whispered that she was glad someone was finally listening to what the men had said. Her friend stared at her hands and worried out loud that if plant's owners got hit hard, no company would ever come back to Gray Ridge. Every conversation carried that same split. Some folks praised Amos for standing up. Others saw his stacks of paper as a kind of betrayal. In a town raised on the idea that you handle things close to home, taking trouble to Columbus felt to many like breaking rank. The radio behind the counter added fuel. Miller kept it tuned to a station from the city. That week, the host opened his call-in show with the Riverpoint story. He spoke about cover-ups, working families, and corporate greed, trying to sound like he knew Gray Ridge though he'd never seen the river. Callers from outside the valley demanded arrests. One voice from town, tight and tired, said only that they'd buried brothers and sons and were sick of being called accidents. Darlene Stokes listened while she refilled mugs.
Each word about fixed reports and changed logs made her grip the pot harder. She knew those changes up close. She also knew the look Leon gave her the last time he walked past her desk, the warning in his eyes even before the fire. If charges came, she could be pulled into the open. Some days that thought felt like relief. Other days, like standing on a high bridge with no rail. Not far away, in pews and on front porches, the same debate went on. Church ladies passing casseroles wondered if suing would stain the dead men's memory. Teenagers who'd grown up in the fire's shadow posted sharp comments on early news articles, angry at any hint that workers had been at fault. Older union men sat on folding chairs in the hall, staring at a wall where old contract photos hung, and asked each other when exactly the code had cracked. Gray Ridge's unwritten rules had always said you look after your own, you don't bring in outsiders unless you must, and you never speak against the place that feeds you. Yet the facts in Amos's notebooks and on those state charts told another story. The place that fed them had cut corners that burned them. That tension sat heavy over Miller's Diner and every kitchen table in town. People were forced to ask themselves which loyalty counted more, the old bond to plant and neighbors, or a harder loyalty to truth written in ink and measured in graves. The investigation had not reached a courtroom yet, but in Gray Ridge, the trial had already begun, in low voices and long looks.
Paper was the only thing that stayed hard. That thought rode with Amos Ritchie as he stepped out into the parking lot, away from the smell of lilies and floor wax. Night had settled over Gray Ridge. The plant lights glowed dull across town, a low orange smear against the sky. Instead of heading home, he turned his truck toward the small rental where Nathan's widow lived with the kids. Her place sat on a narrow street of tired houses. Toys lay in the frozen grass. A porch light buzzed over peeling paint. When she opened the door, her face was pale, eyes rimmed red, black dress already wrinkled from long hours of standing and hugging. Two little ones watched from the hallway, still in their church clothes, shoes kicked off in a heap. Inside, the front room felt close. A couch sagged under the weight of coats and sympathy cards. A small TV sat dark in the corner. Bills and envelopes covered the coffee table, some opened, some still sealed. On the wall, a wedding photo showed Nathan in a borrowed suit, his bride in a simple white dress, both laughing at something out of frame. Amos sat on the edge of a chair, hat in his hands. He wasn't good with soft words. His way had always been work, not talk. Still, he asked how she was holding up, listened while she spoke about casseroles left by neighbors, the kids waking up at night, the way the house sounded wrong without Nathan's boots on the floor. After a time, her voice turned toward money. The plant check would stop. The envelope from the lawyers sat on the mantel, heavy and silent. She picked it up, thumb running along the edge. "They say it's to help," she murmured, "but I got a sign that nothing was their fault." Her eyes went to the pile on the table. "I wrote folks before this. State people, company. Nobody said much back." Those words caught Amos's ear. He leaned forward. On the table, under utility bills and supermarket circulars, lay a stack of letters. Some were neat, written on lined paper, asking simple questions. Why did the alarms fail? Why was line C still running with bad vents? Others were typed form replies on stiff letterhead, thanking her for her concern and assuring her that appropriate steps had been taken. Not one admitted anything clear. Amos picked up a copy she had sent to the plant months before the fire. Nathan had helped her with the wording. It mentioned heat building under the ceiling, the way men came home coughing. Beside it lay the answer, a short note from a manager saying there was no known hazard at this time. He saw dates that matched his notebooks, his warnings, her questions, their silence. A tug of doubt pulled at him. Looking at the children curled up on the couch, he wondered what right he had to drag her into a fight that might last years. The settlement money could keep lights on, buy shoes, pay for school pictures. The company was counting on that pull, on grief and need tying hands tighter than any rope.
Yet those unanswered letters said as much as any report. They showed a pattern. People spoke up, and the system smiled, nodded, and did nothing. If he walked away now, their words died in this room. "Keep every letter," Amos said at last. "Yours, theirs. Don't throw any of it out." She looked tired, but she nodded. He asked if he could borrow a few to copy. She hesitated, then slid several across the table. Back home, in his basement, he laid them beside Darlene's hidden reports and his own notes. Now the pile on his bench held more than one voice. It carried the questions of a widow, the small lies of managers, and the dates that tied them to flickering alarms and short purges. The risk to the families never felt sharper. The need to bind their stories together on paper never seemed more clear.
News in Grey Ridge had never moved as fast as it did on the morning the state attorney general stepped up to a podium with the Riverpoint case file in front of him. Miller's Diner TV, the one that usually flickered ball scores, now showed a seal on a blue curtain and rows of microphones. Folks eating eggs and toast went quiet. Some turned up the volume. Others stared down into their mugs, already guessing what was coming. In Columbus, the AG adjusted his glasses and began to read from prepared notes. He spoke of a pattern of falsified safety records, knowingly dangerous cost-cutting measures, and 18 preventable deaths. Behind those dry words sat Amos Ritchie's notebooks, Darlene Stokes's tucked-away reports, and the letters Nathan's widow had written from her small front room. Names came next. The AG listed Riverpoint's plant manager, safety director, and 2 executives from the parent company. Each faced multiple counts: fraud, tampering with records, and negligent homicide. Then he said the name Grey Ridge knew best: Leonard Pike, line supervisor for Riverpoint Casting Works. At Miller's Diner, a fork clattered onto a plate. Darlene, refilling sugar at a corner table, froze. Across town, in his small house, Amos watched the briefing on a fuzzy screen, standing instead of sitting. Hearing Leon's name spoken in that flat, official tone felt like a door closing on one life and opening onto something colder. The AG's staff passed out printed indictments to reporters. Each page laid out how the vent system had been altered, how purge times had been trimmed, and how incident reports had been corrected to hide growing risk. In the margins of early drafts, aides had written "Source A. Ritchie Notes" and "See original log from D. Stokes." Those marks were gone now in the clean copies, but the structure they'd helped build remained. While cameras rolled at the Capitol, state investigators and county deputies fanned out. One car turned off the highway toward Grey Ridge, gravel pinging its undercarriage as it took the old plant road. They found Leon at his modest split level, out back, in a faded jacket, trying to fix a loose board on the deck. For years, he'd been the man who smoothed things over, the one others went to when they needed a favor upstairs. Today, there was no smooth way through. A deputy stepped on the grass, papers in hand. Neighbors watched through curtains as Leon's smile faltered. The cuffs clicked shut behind his back. He was led to the car, head down, Riverpoint name badge still clipped to his shirt. Someone across the street lifted a camera. The image of Leon Pike, once the laughing man of the line, now trapped behind glass on his way to booking, would land on front pages the next day. At the same time, in a glass office several counties away, one of Riverpoint's executives was told to clear his desk. Staff who had once hurried to bring him coffee now stepped aside as state men walked him out. That quiet reversal rippled down to Grey Ridge in the form of shaky phone calls and rumors. They took him. They're going after the big shots, too. This isn't just on us anymore. Back in town,
Ellen Marsh sat across from Amos in her cluttered office, a copy of the indictment between them. She pointed to a section that cited independent documentation maintained by maintenance foreman Amos Ritchie over a period of years as a key source. For the first time since the fire, he saw his habit of pencil and paper described not as fussiness, but as evidence. On the street below, some folks nodded when they heard about the charges, saying it was about time. Others muttered that dragging Leon off in cuffs in front of his kids was a shame, no matter what he signed. But even the doubters couldn't ignore the fact that the men in suits, the ones who signed off on the vent changes, were finally being named on the same pages as the line boss. Power in Grey Ridge had always run one way, from upstairs to the floor, from office to line, from company to town. That day, for a moment, the current flipped. A quiet maintenance man's notebooks had forced men who never lifted a wrench to stand before the law. The strategy Amos chose, paper, dates, and truth, stacked high enough that even distant eyes had to see, had done what front porch anger and union speeches could not. It had taken the story of the last shift out of rumor and set it on a record that could not be pulled back in. News in Grey Ridge had never moved as fast as it did on the morning the state attorney general stepped up to a podium with the Riverpoint case file in front of him. Miller's Diner TV, the one that usually flickered ball scores, now showed a seal on a blue curtain and rows of microphones. Folks eating eggs and toast went quiet. Some turned up the volume, others stared down into their mugs, already guessing what was coming. In Columbus, the AG adjusted his glasses and began to read from prepared notes. He spoke of a pattern of falsified safety records, knowingly dangerous cost-cutting measures, and 18 preventable deaths. Behind those dry words sat Amos Ritchie's notebooks, Darlene Stokes's tucked-away reports, and the letters Nathan's widow had written from her small front room. Names came next. The AG listed Riverpoint's plant manager, safety director, and 2 executives from the parent company. Each faced multiple counts: fraud, tampering with records, and negligent homicide. Then he said the name Grey Ridge knew best: Leonard Pike, line supervisor for Riverpoint Casting Works. At Miller's Diner, a fork clattered onto a plate. Darlene, refilling sugar at a corner table, froze. Across town, in his small house, Amos watched the same briefing on a fuzzy screen, standing instead of sitting. Hearing Leon's name spoken in that flat, official tone felt like a door closing on one life and opening onto something colder. The AG's staff passed out printed indictments to reporters. Each page laid out how the vent system had been altered, how purge times had been trimmed, and how incident reports had been corrected to hide growing risk. In the margins of early drafts, aides had written "Source, A. Ritchie Notes" and "See Original Log from D. Stokes." Those marks were gone now in the clean copies, but the structure they'd helped build remained. While cameras rolled at the Capitol, state investigators and county deputies fanned out. One car turned off the highway toward Grey Ridge, gravel pinging its undercarriage as it took the old plant road. They found Leon at his modest split level, out back in a faded jacket, trying to fix a loose board on the deck. For years, he'd been the man who smoothed things over, the one others went to when they needed a favor upstairs. Today, there was no smooth way through. A deputy stepped onto the grass, papers in hand. Neighbors watched through curtains as Leon's smile faltered. The cuffs clicked shut behind him. He was led to the car, head down, Riverpoint name badge still clipped to his shirt. Someone across the street lifted a camera. The image of Leon Pike, once the laughing man of the line, now trapped behind glass on his way to booking, would land on front pages the next day. At the same time, in a glass office several counties away, one of Riverpoint's executives was told to clear his desk. Staff who had once hurried to bring him coffee now stepped aside as statemen walked him out. That quiet reversal rippled down to Grey Ridge in the form of shaky phone calls and rumors. They took him. They're going after the big shots too. This isn't just on us anymore." Back in town, Ellen Marsh sat across from Amos in her cluttered office, a copy of the indictment between them. She pointed to a section that cited independent documentation maintained by maintenance foreman Amos Ritchie over a period of years as a key source. For the first time since the fire, he saw his habit of pencil and paper described not as fussiness, but as evidence. On the street below, some folks nodded when they heard about the charges, saying it was about time. Others muttered that dragging Leon off in cuffs in front of his kids was a shame, no matter what he'd signed. But even the doubters couldn't ignore the fact that the men in suits, the ones who'd signed off on the vent changes, were finally being named on the same pages as the line boss. Power in Grey Ridge had always run one way, from upstairs to the floor, from office to line, from company to town. That day, for a moment, the current flipped. A quiet maintenance man's notebooks had forced men who never lifted a wrench to stand before the law. The strategy Amos chose, paper, dates, and truth stacked high enough that even distant eyes had to see, had done what front porch anger and union speeches could not. It had taken the story of the last shift out of rumor and set it on a record that could not be pulled back in. Months after the arrests, the story of Riverpoint Casting Works moved from diners and porches into a tall brick courthouse in the state capital. The old building had marble floors that echoed every step. Reporters lined the front steps, cameras ready. Families from Grey Ridge rode buses and packed the gallery, clutching photos, Greer cards, and folded tissues. For the first time, what happened on the last shift would be laid out in a room where every word was written down. The case was called State versus Pike et al. Leon sat at the defense table in a wrinkled suit, thinner than before, eyes fixed on the wood grain. Beside him sat the former plant manager and safety director. Two executives from the parent company watched from their own row of chairs, flanked by lawyers in dark ties. On the other side, the prosecutor stacked thick binders filled with printouts, photos, and the pages Amos once kept in an ammo box. Jury selection took days. People who worked in mills, people who'd lost cousins in other fires, people with family in big firms all came and went. At last, 12 sat in the box, faces set, sworn to listen and judge. The judge, gray-haired and steady, told them this wasn't about revenge, it was about facts, choices, and duty. The state opened with a slow, clear story. Charts showed Riverpoint's vent system before and after. A timeline on a screen tracked each cut in purge time, each complaint, each altered report. The prosecutor moved methodically, always back to the paper. "You'll see these same dates again," he said more than once. Every time he said it, a page from Amos's notebooks or Darlene's hidden stack appeared on the screen. When Amos took the stand, the room went very quiet. He walked with a limp more pronounced under the bright lights. His hand rested on the rail as he swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked about his work, his notebooks, his warnings. Amos spoke in plain words. He explained how heat should move, how fumes should clear, how the old still lessons had helped him design a safer flow. He pointed to copies of his drawings, now blown up on foam boards. "Is this your handwriting?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Amos said. "Did you file these complaints before the fire?" "I did." "And did anyone from management ever tell you the vent cuts were unsafe?" "No." Cross-examination tried to paint him as bitter, a man blaming others for his son's death. Defense lawyers picked at his past, at the old moonshine charge, at his lack of formal degree, but each time they circled back to the vents, the purge times, the alarm failures, Amos's answers stayed steady and matched the records on the screens. The paper held. Darlene followed. Her hands shook when she held the pen to sign her oath. She told the jury how reports used to look, rough and honest, and how they later came back, cleaned up. She explained why she'd kept the first versions. "Something felt wrong," she said. "I couldn't just throw them out." Defense asked if she feared losing her job. She said yes. That fear had weight in her voice, but it only made the choice to save those forms sound more real. Nathan's widow testified about her letters. She described writing late at night at the kitchen table, asking simple questions, getting careful non-answers. Each response from the company flashed on the screen. The jurors watched her thumb trace Nathan's name on a photo before she stepped down. Leon did not testify. His lawyers advised against it. Instead, the jury heard his words from old memos, from deposition transcripts, from notes he'd sent praising reduced downtime. In one, he'd written that concerns raised by a few overly cautious staff had been addressed. These staff were Amos and others. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. After weeks of testimony, the judge read instructions and the jury filed out. Hours later, they returned. The clerk stood, voice steady, and read count after count. Guilty on multiple charges of tampering with safety records. Guilty on several counts of negligent homicide for Leon and the plant manager. One executive found guilty on fraud, another cleared on the most serious charges but fined heavily in civil court later. The parent company faced steep penalties and orders to overhaul systems across its other plants. Sentencing came on a rainy day. Leon received years in prison, the manager more, the executive a shorter term and lifelong bar from similar work. Fines ran into sums no one in Grey Ridge could quite picture. The judge spoke of betrayed trust, of profits placed above life, and of ordinary workers whose warnings went unheeded. He mentioned by name the detailed records of Mr. Amos Ritchie, calling them crucial to uncovering the truth. In the back row, Amos sat with his hat on his knees, listening without visible joy. This was the outcome his paper trail had aimed toward, the law speaking where the plant had stayed silent. Yet nothing in that room could give Nathan back or clear the smoke from the nights that still woke him. The verdict had turned his quiet habit into a blade sharp enough to cut through lies, but every cut left another scar.
When the judge's words faded and the courtroom emptied, the Riverpoint case didn't end, it just changed shape. Executives went home under bond to wait for prison. Leon Pike traded his worn work boots for state-issue shoes. Amos Ritchie walked out the courthouse doors into sharp daylight, hat in hand, feeling no lift in his chest. The men who'd cut corners had been named and sentenced, but the hole Nathan left at his kitchen table stayed the same size. In the months that followed, investigators kept combing through records tied to Riverpoint. They weren't all looking backward. Some were checking how often this kind of thing happened. Others, like a young agent from the Alcohol and Firearms Office, started asking questions sideways. Amos's old notebooks held more than vent sketches. Here and there sat diagrams of small coils, mash temperatures, and notes about a rifle he'd kept tucked behind a basement beam back in the leanest years. Those scribbles were nothing like what Riverpoint had done. Still, on paper, they were violations. Ellen Marsh laid it out for him in her cramped office. If he fought, they'd drag things out, pry into every corner of his life, and maybe shake faith in the notes that had just won the case. If he pled to a low felony for unlicensed distilling and an unregistered firearm, the state would treat it as separate and done. Amos didn't like the taste of that choice, but he had spent his whole life weighing bad options. This time, he thought about what mattered most, keeping his testimony strong and his family's name tied to the truth about Riverpoint, not to talk of technicalities. So he signed. A judge later gave him a short stretch in a medium-security prison, calling it a necessary mark of the law for old wrongs. The first time his daughter visited, the room held metal tables bolted to the floor and painted lines that told people where to sit. Fluorescent lights buzzed. Other families murmured around them. Amos wore a plain brown uniform, state ID clipped to his chest. Across from him, she looked older than her years, grief and pride pulling her features tight. She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a clean letter from a regional safety institute thanking Amos for donating his vent designs and maintenance notes for study.
Ellen had brokered it. The terms were strict. His layouts would be used to teach about safe flow and failure, not to build a new profit stream. Any grant money or speaking fees tied to the Ritchie Flow case would feed a fund for the children of the 18 men who'd died. The ammo box that once sat under his basement bench now lived in a climate-controlled archive room, each notebook sleeved and labeled. The Institute had copied his diagrams into training manuals. A footnote in small type gave him credit by name. It wasn't a patent, and it didn't put money in his pocket, but it placed his work where no manager could erase it again. Behind the wire, Amos settled into a narrow rhythm. He rose early, walked slow laps around the yard, worked in the prison shop when his knees allowed. In the evenings, he sat on a bunk and wrote in cheap composition books. He didn't draw events anymore. He wrote dates and names, small memories of Nathan, short notes about the men he'd met inside. Habit more than hope moved his hand. On the common room television, he sometimes caught news segments about new state vent standards and post-Gray Ridge reforms. Reporters spoke of regulations that now required longer purges, better alarms, independent log audits. They used phrases lifted from Ellen's filings and OSHA's reports. They never said his name on those broadcasts, but he recognized the shape of his old basement sketches in the diagrams they flashed. Ruth sent letters until her health failed. Nathan's widow once said the fund had helped pay for her daughter's welding classes. She wants to work with metal, but in a place that listens, the line read. Amos read that sentence 3 times, thumb pressed hard into the paper. He did not claim heroism when other inmates asked why he was there. He said only that he'd made shine when he shouldn't have and kept a rifle he hadn't registered. And telling the truth about a fire had stirred up more than he'd planned. At night, when the lights dimmed and the block went quiet, his mind drifted back to Line C, to Nathan's easy grin under a hard hat, and to the knowledge that every life his notes might save would still never square the ledger for the one he'd lost.
Years slid by, while Amos walked his slow laps behind the fence. Seasons turned over Gray Ridge. The sharp noise of the trial faded, but the fire's shadow stayed in the small ways life moved for the families it had cut. On the edge of town, where a Little League diamond once sat, the county built a memorial park. A low stone wall curved around a patch of grass. 18 names were carved into it, each letter cut deep. A narrow path led past young trees and a flagpole that snapped on windy days. On the first anniversary after the trial, someone set a mill bench there with a small plate screwed to the back. In memory of the Riverpoint 18, may their work not be forgotten, nor their loss ignored. Nathan's widow came often. She would bring the children after school, their backpacks bumping against their sides as they ran ahead. The kids liked the open space, the way their voices carried in the air. She liked the quiet. She would sit on the bench, trace Nathan's name with her finger, and watch her daughter climb the small hill and roll back down, hair full of grass. Bills still came, but the civil settlements and the fund built from fines and Amos's donation took some weight off. The scholarship tied to the Ritchie name helped with tech classes and work boots when her son grew old enough to take on part-time jobs. Other families made their own rituals. One father came alone every Sunday, dressed in his good shirt, laying a single tool, a wrench, a tape measure, a hard hat sticker, at the base of the stone before taking it home again. A mother from the far side of town tended a small flower bed by the names, pulling weeds with steady hands, talking under her breath to the son she'd lost. For them, the park was both a wound and a promise that what had happened would not be swept away entirely. Leon Pike's family rarely stepped onto that grass. His wife moved away 2 towns over during the first year of his sentence. Neighbors said she couldn't stand the looks in the grocery aisle, the half-cut greetings, the way people dropped their voices when she walked into Miller's diner.
His oldest boy, who had once worn a Riverpoint cap like a badge, threw it in the trash the week the verdict came down. He finished school and left the valley, taking a job in a warehouse near the interstate. The younger son tried staying, but every time he filled out a form, teachers and bosses saw his last name and paused. There were nights years later when the Pike boys sat on different couches in different towns watching a news piece on industrial safety reforms after Gray Ridge. Leon's name would flash as a warning case. They'd change the channel. For them, their father was both the man who taught them to ride bikes and the one whose choices had written their family into a story they never asked for. The executives' families felt the blast in other ways. One man's kids grew up far from Gray Ridge, in suburbs where no one knew the word Riverpoint. Yet the internet eventually caught up. A classmate would search his father's name and find old articles about fines and fraud. Schoolyard taunts turned on words like killer and crook. In their house, dinner went quiet any time the past came near. Money still flowed, but it couldn't buy the easy respect the man once held in his own circles. Back in Gray Ridge, the victims' children grew at uneven speeds. Some wanted nothing to do with metal or factories. They took jobs in stores, joined the military, or left for community colleges in bigger places, using scholarship checks that carried the Ritchie case in their footnotes. Others felt a strange pull back to the kind of work that had taken their parents. One boy became a safety inspector, driving from plant to plant with a clipboard and a haunted attention to vents and alarms. A girl, Nathan's daughter, learned to weld and fix heavy trucks. She kept a small, worn photo of her father in her toolbox, face smudged where greasy fingers had touched it too many times. Family holidays turned into quiet tests. At Thanksgiving tables, older relatives would still argue in low voices. Some thanked Amos out loud for not letting them call it an accident. Others muttered that if he'd just kept his head down, maybe another company would have bought Riverpoint instead of letting it rot. Younger people sat between those views, feeling the divide like a draft through the room. Amos's own family made their peace as best they could. Ruth's health never fully came back from the year of funerals and court trips. She died before his release date. Her funeral held at the same home that had once laid out Nathan. His daughter chose a simple service. At the front, beside Ruth's picture, the director placed a small framed copy of the letter from the Safety Institute that named the Ritchie flow records as part of their training work. It was the only nod in that room to the wider story beyond their loss. Letters from prison crossed back and forth between Amos and his daughter. She wrote about the kids' school plays, about the memorial park, about the first time she heard a stranger mention Gray Ridge standards like a fixed phrase. He answered with small stories, a bird that nested on the yard fence, a book a guard had lent him, a dream where he walked the lined sea floor and found it empty and cool, just sound of air moving right. For the families who'd lost someone that night, the verdicts and fines sat like weights on a different scale from their grief. Some days, knowing that someone had paid, with time, with money, with reputation, helped them breathe easier. Other days, it all felt thin compared to the simple wish to hear an old laugh in the kitchen again. The paper trail Amos had built did what he hoped in one sense. It cleared the men on that last shift from blame and wrote responsibility on the people who tried to hide it. It also tied every family on every side to a story that would outlive them, carved in stone on a hillside and into training manuals 100 miles away.
In the decades after the fire, Gray Ridge and the wider valley changed in ways that were easy to see from the highway. Drivers crossing the river bridge no longer saw smoke curling from Riverpoint's stacks. Instead, they passed a long, low shape of rusted metal and broken windows. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete where men once parked for night shift. Far from town, state planners drew new maps. In reports with color charts and dry titles, they marked the Gray Ridge event as a turning point.
New vent rules and purge standards carried that name in footnotes. Gray Ridge-type flashover prevention. Inspectors in other states learned about a plant they'd never visit, a line they'd never walk, and a quiet foreman whose notes had forced change. Along the edge of Gray Ridge, cheap land drew other kinds of work. A warehouse went up where a cornfield used to stand, all bright lights and loading bays. A big box store followed, then a strip of smaller shops with empty spaces between hair salons and payday lenders. Jobs came back in pieces, stocking, driving, ringing up sales. None of them paid what Riverpoint once had, and none carried the same sense that a man could stay in one place for 40 years. On the low hill above town, the memorial park stayed green. Trees grew taller, their shade falling wider over the stone wall of names. A simple brown sign on the roadside pointed toward it, Riverpoint Workers Memorial. County officials had fought over the wording. Some wanted accident, others pushed for disaster. The final metal plate used neither. It let the names speak on their own. Inside a small brick building near the courthouse, the county museum added a corner case labeled Industrial Gray Ridge. Behind the glass sat a hard hat, a bent length of vent pipe, and a faded Riverpoint badge. A copy of the Safety Institute's manual lay open to a diagram of the old system and the safer version drawn from Amos Ritchie's notes. A plaque under it read, "Used with permission, donated by the Ritchie family." School groups came through once in a while. Children traced the shapes with their eyes, half bored, half curious. Guides told them that before their time, men worked in hotter, louder places, and rules written after one bad night now kept other crews alive. Some kids took it in, others just waited for the part of the tour with dinosaur bones and war medals. Outside the valley, companies adjusted. Large firms spent money on better alarms and longer purges, not out of kindness, because fines from cases like Riverpoint cut into profits. Insurance carriers wrote Gray Ridge clauses into policies, warning that fake safety logs could void coverage. Training videos for new supervisors used a mix of staged scenes and real photos from Line C. A few seconds of grainy black and white showed the burned shell of the floor where Nathan and the others had stood. Inside Gray Ridge itself, older wounds lingered. The Union Hall sat quieter, roof patched in places, parking lot full only on bingo nights. Younger people drove past without looking up. Many of their jobs were not union at all. Pills and later meth worked through some streets, filling the gaps left by steady pay and clear purpose. A different kind of code grew in those corners, one that cared less for plant rules and more for quick cash. Yet the memory of the last shift did not vanish. A roadside historical marker, put up with state funds, told a short version of the story. It spoke of workers who raised concerns, of records that revealed hidden risk, and of legal action that led to stronger standards. Tourists rarely stopped to read it. Locals passed by often enough that the words sank in over time. Aerial photos taken for a later planning study showed the town from high above. In one frame, the memorial park's green curve, the rusted outline of Riverpoint, the busy store lots and rows of old houses all fit together. To planners, those images marked transition. To people who lived under that sky, they marked something harder to name. A place that had paid in blood to teach others a rule that should have been known all along. The paper Amos once kept in an ammo box now rested in climate-controlled stacks, and the systems built from it stretched far beyond the Ohio line. Gray Ridge itself lived with both sides of that legacy. It had helped make other plants safer. It had also learned, the hard way, that even when the law listened, the cost of getting its attention could hollow out a town for a very long time. Boxes stacked along a cool back wall held what was left of Riverpoint on paper. The Regional Historical Society kept them in a quiet archive room, away from school tours and noisy displays. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A dehumidifier clicked on and off. On one shelf, a white label read in neat black letters, Ritchie, Amos, Riverpoint case. Near that shelf, a long table waited for researchers. Staff rolled one box out, set it down, and slipped on cotton gloves. Inside lay things you have heard about already, but here they looked smaller. Amos's narrow notebooks, each in a clear sleeve, copies of Darlene's saved reports, letters from Nathan's widow, court transcripts thick with legal words, the whole path from quiet warnings to a packed courtroom, resting still in cardboard. 2 stories sat in those folders. One was official. That version ran through memos, government stamps, verdicts, and safety manuals. It said a plant cut corners, men died, people kept records, and the law answered. The other story lived in the spaces around the paper. That one followed funeral home lines, diner talks, children who grew up without a parent, and an old man walking circles in a prison yard. Violence in Grey Ridge did not come from a gun in this tale. It came from heat and gas trapped where they should not have been. It came from timesheets that lied by leaving out fear. It came from forms that turned strong warnings into soft, minor issues. That kind of harm moved slower than a bullet, yet the end result in that factory was the same: bodies on the floor, names on stones. Amos chose a different kind of force when he reached for his notebooks. Paper became his weapon. He did not swing it like a club. He stacked it, dated it, and carried it into rooms where men in ties could no longer say, "We did not know." His code from the hills said you protect what is yours. The world he stood in by 1988 said if you wanted power to hear you, you needed proof in ink. Legacy sat at the center of his choice. His father's still tricks, his own line sketches, the vent routes he built to keep men breathing. All of that felt like the one true thing he owned. Leon's theft struck him like an attack on blood, not just on pay. Protecting that craft by giving it over to a safety institute was a strange act. He saved it by giving it away. Some would say that move honored the recipe. Others might say it turned a private code into public property. Justice in this story did not ride in clean. The law came late after 18 workers were gone. Courts punished some people and fined others. Yet no judge's order could make Riverpoint rise again or call Nathan back through his front door. Amos's paper trail forced the system to speak, but every word it uttered walked over ground already soaked in loss. Local code and distant rule met head-on here. Grey Ridge had long believed in handling things ourselves. That habit kept peace during small disputes. It also kept early warnings locked inside union halls and offices when outside eyes might have helped. On the other side, the state only woke up when a file thick enough to trip over landed on a desk. Until then, men from the valley were just numbers in old ledgers. Revenge usually looks simple in stories told fast. A man is wronged, he strikes back, and someone falls. In Amos's case, the strike was slow. It did not aim at Leon's body. It aimed at his signature, his memos, his choices spread across years. The courts took Leon's freedom instead of his life. That spared children from another funeral, but it still left them carrying a last name tied to tragedy. Looking at those boxes, a person has to ask what victory really meant. Amos cleared the dead men of blame. He marked the people who had twisted his work. He helped change rules far beyond Grey Ridge. He also ended his days behind a fence with his notebooks kept in a place he could not reach. The very act that saved his legacy as fact cost him his remaining freedom. Future readers who open those folders will see tidy labels and numbered pages. They might not feel the heat that once rolled down Line C or hear the sirens over the river. That gap between what is written and what was lived sits at the heart of this tale. The records tell a story of justice done, the town's silence on some nights, and the way folks still glance toward the dead plant tell another. From that quiet archive room, the view of the case widens again when a different kind of light comes on. Not in Gray Ridge, but in a spare bedroom 2 states away, a ring light glows over a desk. A true crime host settles into a chair, checks her notes, and taps the record button. On the wall behind her hangs a map of the Ohio Valley with a small pin stuck in Gray Ridge. On the desk sit copies of the same photos and documents you have walked through in this story. Plant diagrams, court headlines, a grainy shot of Leon in handcuffs, a faded picture of Amos standing outside the courthouse in his one dark suit. On screen, she tells her viewers this is the Riverpoint casting case, sometimes called the last shift in Ohio. She explains how a small town depended on one factory, how a vent change meant to save money helped trap gas over Line C, and how 18 men never made it home. She talks about Amos Ritchie, the quiet maintenance foreman who lost his son, and about the mountain habits he carried north. She points out how he did not pick up a gun or a gas can. Instead, he picked up his notebooks and walked them into a lawyer's office. As she speaks, images slide across the screen. An excerpt from an OSHA report scrolls past. A page from the Attorney General's complaint highlights phrases about falsified logs and preventable deaths. A photo shows the memorial wall in Gray Ridge, names carved deep. Another clip shows the safety manual that now uses the Ritchie flow diagrams in training. The host lets the facts stack up, then pauses. She asks her audience what they think justice looked like here. Time in prison for Leon and the managers, fines for the company, or the way Amos's notes now help protect strangers he would never meet. Hours after the video goes live, the comments begin to fill. A woman from West Virginia writes that her uncle worked at a different mill and died young. She calls Amos a hero. A man who says he grew up in Gray Ridge replies that Amos killed the last good jobs by going to the state. Someone else, who signs as a cousin, says Leon was not evil, just weak, and that the company used him. Farther down, a younger viewer posts that she plans to study industrial safety because of cases like this one. Seated at her desk, the host reads those words and knows this story still cuts along old lines. Loyalty to place, fear of being erased, anger at systems that only wake up after people die. She records a short closing segment. In it, she reminds viewers that Amos's choice to fight with paper did not come cheap. He cleared the dead of blame and forced new rules, but he spent his final years behind a fence, and his town never fully healed. Then she turns back to the camera and leaves the questions with you. If someone stole your family's only legacy and 18 workers died, would you trust the law or your own code? Would you have done what Amos did or walked away? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you want more stories told this way, go ahead and subscribe. In the end, the boxes in that archive and the pixels on her screen carry weight. They ask what a life, a name, and a town are worth when systems fail, and who steps up to bear cost.
Paper was the only thing that stayed hard. That thought rode with Amos Ritchie as he stepped out into the parking lot, away from the smell of lilies and floor wax. Night had settled over Gray Ridge. The plant lights glowed dull across town, a low orange smear against the sky. Instead of heading home, he turned his truck toward the small rental where Nathan's widow lived with the kids. Her place sat on a narrow street of tired houses. Toys lay in the frozen grass. A porch light buzzed over peeling paint. When she opened the door, her face was pale, eyes rimmed red, black dress already wrinkled from long hours of standing and hugging. Two little ones watched from the hallway, still in their church clothes, shoes kicked off in a heap. Inside, the front room felt close. A couch sagged under the weight of coats and sympathy cards. A small TV sat dark in the corner. Bills and envelopes covered the coffee table, some opened, some still sealed. On the wall, a wedding photo showed Nathan in a borrowed suit, his bride in a simple white dress, both laughing at something out of frame. Amos sat on the edge of a chair, hat in his hands. He wasn't good with soft words. His way had always been work, not talk. Still, he asked how she was holding up, listened while she spoke about casseroles left by neighbors, the kids waking up at night, the way the house sounded wrong without Nathan's boots on the floor. After a time, her voice turned toward money. The plant check would stop. The envelope from the lawyers sat on the mantel, heavy and silent. She picked it up, thumb running along the edge. "They say it's to help," she murmured, "but I got a sign that nothing was their fault." Her eyes went to the pile on the table. "I wrote folks before this. State people, company. Nobody said much back." Those words caught Amos's ear. He leaned forward. On the table, under utility bills and supermarket circulars, lay a stack of letters. Some were neat, written on lined paper, asking simple questions. Why did the alarms fail? Why was line C still running with bad vents? Others were typed form replies on stiff letterhead, thanking her for her concern and assuring her that appropriate steps had been taken. Not one admitted anything clear. Amos picked up a copy she had sent to the plant months before the fire. Nathan had helped her with the wording. It mentioned heat building under the ceiling, the way men came home coughing. Beside it lay the answer, a short note from a manager saying there was no known hazard at this time. He saw dates that matched his notebooks, his warnings, her questions, their silence. A tug of doubt pulled at him. Looking at the children curled up on the couch, he wondered what right he had to drag her into a fight that might last years. The settlement money could keep lights on, buy shoes, pay for school pictures. The company was counting on that pull, on grief and need tying hands tighter than any rope. Yet those unanswered letters said as much as any report. They showed a pattern. People spoke up, and the system smiled, nodded, and did nothing. If he walked away now, their words died in this room. "Keep every letter," Amos said at last. "Yours, theirs. Don't throw any of it out." She looked tired, but she nodded. He asked if he could borrow a few to copy. She hesitated, then slid several across the table. Back home, in his basement, he laid them beside Darlene's hidden reports and his own notes. Now the pile on his bench held more than one voice. It carried the questions of a widow, the small lies of managers, and the dates that tied them to flickering alarms and short purges. The risk to the families never felt sharper. The need to bind their stories together on paper never seemed more clear.